Team Liquid is back. After a second place finish in the FNCS squad warm-ups, they are looking impressive for a number of different reasons. If you don't know the roster that I'm talking about 72 Hours. I'm talking about Chap, Vivid, as well as a member from Tempo Storm of Sis Lucky. Now, of course, if you have been following Team Liquid for quite some time, you're very familiar with at least three of them, or if not all of them, but at least three for sure. And that consists of course, Chap, Vivid, as well as Sis Lucky, who competed together in the Trios Cup and did very well. But overall, before we get to talking about TL and how they are back, let me first give you a little backstory of the four members that are competing together. Now, of course, I mentioned, a little bit earlier about the Trios Championship. It was very successful for at least three of them, and that includes, of course, Champ, Vivid, as well as Sis Lucky from Tempo Storm. They ended up getting second place just behind that of Zexro, Young Calculator, and Macwood by just 1 point. So obviously, these three know how to play together. They've got the team chemistry locked down, and they have been very successful in their own right. So it's nice to see them competing once again on the same roster, at least for FNCS squads. Now, of course, talking about 72 Hours, we all know him. He's probably one of my favorite streamers, not only because he's entertaining and funny, but more so because he's very smart and he makes 300 IQ plays literally nonstop, plus his snipes are absolutely nasty. And on top of that, he's one of the older ones, which means I get along with him since I'm 27, about to be 28. I can relate to him probably more so than anyone else. But regardless of the fact, during the Trios Cup, I was pretty sad for 72 Hours. And the reason is he was competing with Tfue and Cloaksy, and that roster looked very talented, obviously, on paper. They were performing quite well during the first qualifier round. They ended up getting 5th place. From there, they were struggling a little bit, but it made sense. If you guys remember, Tfue ended up taking a break from streaming and competitive, but that also meant by September 15th, we had to see at least Tyler 15 come through and compete with Cloaksy as well as 72 Hours. So it kind of threw the trios off. And I think it really limited 72 Hours' potential to make it towards finals and maybe even compete against his his current Team Liquid roster that I mentioned before of Chat Vivid as well as Sis Lucky from Tempo Storm. It would have been interesting to see him compete. Unfortunately, he didn't get to, but nonetheless, he is here for the FNCS squads, and they are looking solid all together. But I kind of wanted to talk about today's video in terms of this roster and what makes this roster so deadly. Why is TL back? Well, there is a number of different reasons. I'll go through 3 of them. And the number one thing that stands out to me is their leadership. Chap is the IGL in my mind. Secondary to that, or at least just ahead of that of 72 Hours. I think 72 Hours is a great complementary factor to that of Chap. Chap is always throwing out some great communication, some great comms. More importantly, as Bala TW actually mentions him, he is the rotational master, and it's kind of been deemed that way all the way back towards Season 3, Season 4 of Fortnite on the old map. Chap was always great at rotations. Team Liquid, in fact, was always known as the rotational masters, and they performed quite well. But we didn't get to see squads competitive back then, and we don't know how successful they would have been, at least previously. But now, with Chap leading the way in 72 Hours, kind of being that secondary backbone for the IGL, for the team leads, their roster performs well in a considerable number of ways. Most importantly, like I just mentioned, right, their rotations are on point. You also have 72 Hours who's consistently talking about getting tags so they can avoid the storm surge. There were plenty of times where they would get into an engagement and they would, knock 2 players, or they would just get a couple of tags, and 72 Hours would call out, hey, let's go ahead and disengage. Let's focus on our rotation. Let's get away from this fight because we're doing well on storm surge. We don't have to go in full send and risk losing any of our teammates. Maybe going for a reboot van. If it happens later on in the game, right, they don't want to lose their teammates because then they're going to be in constant 3v4s, 2v4s, maybe even a 1v4 at best. So you kind of start looking at that, and you really have to appreciate Chap calling out the rotations, 72 Hours calling out for the storm surge, and of course, Vivid and Sis Lucky, not to discredit any of them whatsoever, they all have a voice. But I gotta say, having that IGL be very transparent of Chap as well as 72 hours being there as the backbone, it makes the team communications work extremely well. And that leads me into my second point as to why this roster is back and they're so deadly. And that is for simply the communications. I was listening to the comms throughout the entirety of their games that they played for the warm up. And I have to say, it was very refreshing to hear. You go into a lot of these pro player streams and you listen to their comms and they're talking like madmen. There's constantly like, oh, I got a knock, I got a tag here, 24 shield. It sounds like an auctioneer just talking. You never know, you don't understand what he's saying maybe but every 2 or 3 words, but not the case with this Team Liquid roster. They're always clearing comms for the IGL for Chap 72 hours to come through and talk. On top of that, they're only communicating the most dire of information. For example, oh, they got a knock, or hey, I'm going to finish this guy to get the damage for Storm Surge, even if they didn't even get the knock for that guy. Of course, they're timing their grenades. If there's grenades coming in on them, they're calling that out immediately and saying, hey, back off, turbo build, right? We got to avoid this damage. We don't want any of you guys to go down. Overall, their communication is great, and it can be highlighted by game number 1 during the FNCS squad warm-ups. There was a crucial moment where the half and half was coming up and we needed to see a rotation into zone. Unfortunately, they were not blessed with the new circle. In fact, they had to literally go the longest distance and go all the way across basically towards Salty. And there was a moment where Chap cleared comms and he said, hey, I need your guys' mats. And it was at this point where we saw Sizz Lucky come up and he actually split his mats and gave him, I believe it was like 250 brick, 250 metal, and some wood. And that allowed Chap to go through as the main guy who tunnels for the team to tunnel up towards Log House, okay? That put them now into the safe zone. At that point in time, he then takes over high ground, gets on top of that log house, and then tunnels his way into the next moving zone. After doing this, he spots an opportunity on a team just above him on high ground, gets the knock, and then immediately calls for his team to rotate up, take over high ground, as they knew it was going to be their game from that point forward. And in fact, they got the victory royale along with 9 eliminations. That's massive, and that put them, I think, at like 25, 26 points over the course of at least that first game, and it set them up very nicely to be very solid throughout the rest of the at least the warm-up. And in fact, they finished off at 88 points, just 1 point behind that of first place. It was a great performance, and it was all because of those clear comms. Now, the third thing that makes this team so deadly is the fact that their play styles fit in with the meta perfectly. We all know that, of course, with this new meta, with Chapter 2 Season 1, mobility has been reduced greatly, both vertical and lateral. But more importantly, this favors this squad so incredibly much because, like I said before, you go back to Season 3 and Season 4, where there wasn't all this mobility to disengage or, vertical mobility to just take over high ground instantly. TL did very, very well in that meta because of their ability to put themselves in a great position on rotations. And this meta honestly complements them so incredibly well in that regard. You have to be smart. And a lot of these mechanically skilled players, you go back and you look at Mongrel, or you look at a couple of others who are so mechanically gifted, but they don't necessarily have that competitive knowledge to put themselves in a good position in late game or even in beginning or mid game, right? That's something TL thrives at. And because of that, this meta complements them so incredibly well. Overall, though, the squad is looking impressive, and they are looking, honestly, probably one of the most deadliest squads out there. I'm very excited to watch them play, especially during the first qualifier for FNCS squads. But I do want to point out one of their biggest issues that probably needs to be addressed, and that is their landing location. Worked out very well for them during the warm-ups, but Frenzy Farm, if it does in fact start to get challenged over time, which by the way, during the entire warm-up, they weren't challenged at all, but you start moving into, the qualifiers, maybe they're in, just before they even make the finals, you may run into squads that just want to land to grief them, right? You may land into squads who are going to challenge them for that landing location. And if you happen to have that, it then becomes a toss-up. You may lose your teammates early on. You may lose all of your lives, and therefore you're totally nullifying that first game, you're losing all of those potential points you could have been gaining. And that really puts a tampering on your overall ability to make it into the next spot, whether it's the next qualifier or the final. So, for them, I think it would be greatly beneficial for them to find at least 2 or 3 consistent landing spots that they can ride on, and then therefore they can make a quick audible. For example, if they see maybe a squad hopping off the Frenzy Farm, they can maybe rotate out. They can go wherever they please to go, but at least 2 or 3 more landing spots so they can make those quick audibles and they can be more consistent over time, especially if they feel like they're going to be challenged off the start. Overall, though, I got to say their performance was probably one of the most impressive performances that I witnessed during the warm-up. I'm excited to see how Team Liquid is going to be able to compete in the future. Being a Team Liquid fan myself, hey, I'm going to be supporting the boys, and hopefully we'll see the success they had during the warm-ups in the future FNCS squad competitions.